it's Julia, your cycling coach and triathlon coach. I want to show you this afternoon how to tune up your bikes. This is not a professional tune-up. This is the light tune-up that you can do from home, as we're on stay-home orders right now with the COVID-19. So I do recommend taking your bike into the bike shop as well. But this is what I do before I take my bike out on the road or before I race my bike in the summertime. So I've got everything set up here. All my tools are ready to go. And I've got my shoes, I've got my helmets. I want to check everything before I take my bike out on the road. Happy spring to everybody. We're just about to get those bikes out on the road. 13 degrees today in Ottawa. So as you can see, I've got all the tools here, and we've got the most important piece here is we want to make sure that we get our Di2 battery charged up before we take it on the road. Sometimes over the winter those batteries can deplete, and then we get back out on the road and realize that we can only stay in the small chain ring. So if you do have Di2 electronic shifting, make sure you plug your bike in before you get started. The other thing I want to plug in is my Garmin. Make sure I know how fast I'm going, what my power is, and all of that good stuff. So those are your two electronic pieces that you want to make sure that you plug in right away. I also have my bento box here. I want to go through that and make sure that I've got all the tools I need out on the road. Maybe I got a flat last fall and I don't remember it, so I've got my cartridge in here, got my tool repair kit, and I've got much needed tube just in case we get a flat. So just check in on your tool kit and make sure that it's complete, because we don't always remember if we got a flat last fall and that we used up that tube or that CO2 cartridge. So that looks pretty good. We're gonna get to degreasing right away because we need that to dry off first. So I got my degreaser here, and it's a bio degreaser. So I'm gonna start to pour that all onto the drivetrain and onto the chain to take the grease off first before we put the good grease back on. Over the winter, it sits in the basement and it gets kind of dusty. So even though I cleaned it up in the fall, I want to make sure that I give it another cleanup. So we take the degreaser and then put it on the chain, up and down, and start to take the grease off the chain, just like that. And you can see as I go through that, I'm starting to wipe the grease off, but it's also starting to put some of the degreaser on the back chain ring. So we're going to just keep filing it through like that, taking off the grease. You can see it's pretty dirty. And then it should be good to go. Then we can take a little bit of that degreaser and put it on the back there. And we've got this handy tool to clean it up. Taking it all off. All that grease off, cleaning it up. We want it to be nice and shiny that first ride. So you can file it through like that. If you don't have a tool like this, you can use, everybody's got one of those, a nasty dirty toothbrush, and clean up some of the spots on that cartridge at the back there. So it's starting to get pretty clean. I want to make sure I wipe all that degreaser off before I put on the lube. So I'm just going to let that sit for a little bit as it starts to dry off and put that down. Woo! We got a wind coming up. So next up I want to check my helmets and make sure that they're fitting properly. So maybe some of the straps got loose over the winter or the last ride. So I want to make sure that it's nice and tight and properly fitted. I would recommend going into the mirror at this point and having a look in the mirror and making sure that the straps fall right below the ears and that the helmet is good and tight. And I've got a nice adjustment piece in the back to adjust it. So I'm pretty happy with the fit on that helmet. So that one's good to go. And then I got my racing helmet as well, so I would check that one. Next up, I'm going to check my shoes. Got my shoes here. You want to make sure that the clips are nicely secured. So I'm just going to play around with that and wiggle it around and make sure that it's secure. And this piece hasn't moved at all over the summer of last year. They're in pretty good shape right now, so I would say I'm okay. There's no chipping or cracking here, so they should be good to go for another season. But we do want to check in throughout the season to make sure that these haven't chipped or cracked so that your foot doesn't suddenly come out of the pedals. The other thing, you want to check around and make sure there's no dirt, and I usually just take a screwdriver around it and see if there's any dirt. There's a little bit in there, so I'm just going to take that out and clean those up. But otherwise they're in pretty good shape. And then you would do that with the other shoes, checking in on the bottom, and they've got very little wear and tear, so they're in good shape. Wiggling them around, making sure they're good. Just a little bit of dirt in there I'll take out of there. Otherwise they're in good shape. Okay, so we've checked the shoes. Next up, we want to look at the wheels and make sure that the spokes are nice and tight and that they didn't come loose. Now this is something you might want to get your bike shop to clean up, so I'm just going to go around and check and make sure that all the spokes are there and they're good and tight. Checking them in on the front and on the back. Now you may have noticed this wheel's not moving. So we have a problem with the brakes. So I've got the brake levers the old style. Everybody's got different brakes now. So I'm going to loosen up the brakes, and you can see that gets them to move. And then I'm going to just align them and move them here and check in. It's still rubbing, so I'm going to loosen it up again and move them. Now this could also mean that I need to tighten up a bolt somewhere because it's not, it's coming loose quite often. And it's moving this way now, so over there. And we're good to go. All right, so we fixed that up. Next we want to check on the tires. So when you're checking the tires, you want to look to see if there's any cracks in the tire, any kind of wear and tear that doesn't look right. Give it a full inspection, and that's looking pretty good. If you see that the tire is flat on the top here, then that's a sign that you need a new tire. This one's nice and round, it's got a lovely curve here, so it's good to go. My other bike may be a different story. I use that more often. All right, next up I'm going to take the green fizz and clean up the bike. So with the green fizz we can spray the bike. It's looking pretty nasty here, a lot of grease here. So just spray it and give it a wipe. Want that nice red, white, and blue shining through. Taking off the grease. And while you're doing this, you may start to notice whether or not there's any chips or cracks or something that doesn't look right. It's a really good idea to be able to look at your bike quite often and inspect it and make sure that everything's good. And while I'm going through, I'm looking at all the cables to make sure that there's no cracking, no breaks in the cables, and that everything is good. Taking the dust off. Checking the front wheel, making sure that's good, and I can see there I'm going to have to adjust that brake as well. When we move the bikes around, the brakes tend to shift around a little bit. So that's looking good. All right. Then you want to check and make sure that all the bolts are nice and tight, especially the one for the saddles. So I've got a nice tool here that's going to fit. Move the other one. And we're going to just make sure that that's good and tight. And there's the right size. All right, so that's good and tight there. Oh, and I've got a race number on here. That's a bit dorky, so we don't want to be riding around town with our race number from last year. So we'll take that off. Ready for starting a new season. Anyway, I'll do that later. You get the gist of it. So checking on both sides and making sure that those bolts are nice and tight, and looking in on the brake cables, making sure there's no cracking, making sure they're good and tight. Checking on the front brake cables, making sure those are good and tight. just generally doing an inspection. Now the wheels are something that you want the bike shop to do. They can see to make sure that they're all in alignment. What you can do is just make sure that they're moving nicely in their hubs and that they're moving properly. We got a little bit of rubbing on the front brake here, so we would check in on that and make sure that that's all set up properly, and check in on the hubs to make sure that they're nicely secured. Maybe I finished last season in a race and I want to make sure that that's good and tight, that I just didn't throw it back on and throw it into the basement. So we can loosen that up and make sure that it's good and tight, and check in on that and press it down. That's better, that's good and tight. Okay, so we'll check in on the degreaser. See how that's doing. Give it another wipe. And that's looking pretty shiny. Can't wait to get out on my bike. It's a bit greasy here, so I'm just going to clean that up as well. Well, I've got a little degreaser on the towel here. Check the brakes, make sure that the brakes are working. Oh yeah, nice and quick. And now we put on the lube. So you want to use a nice dry lube because it's a beautiful day. You can use a wet lube for a rainy day, but for a nice sunny day, we throw on some dry lube. This just makes your bike fly beautifully, especially if you're about to do a race. It's always fun to have that bike just feeling really smooth. So I'm going to do the same thing I did with the degreaser. Just put a little bit of the lube on the chain and then just start to pedal it through. Adding a little bit more. You don't want to put too much of this stuff. You don't want it to get all gunky, but you want to have enough that you feel like the bike's moving nicely. And then just to make sure, you want to add just a little bit and then shift gears so that your degreaser gets, or so the lube gets onto the cassette. So I think that's about it. That's how I'm going to start my season. Oh, and I'm going to pump up my tires. Forgot about that. So you want to make sure you pump up your tires, check the tire pressure. Right now it's trendy to go on the low end of the tire pressure rather than on the high end. We used to try to pump up the tire to 120 psi until the pump blew off on the tire. Now it's more like 80. So when you're looking at your tires, you can see how many psi they suggest, and now we're going on the low end rather than the high end. So I wouldn't do that on my lovely little hack tool here. I would do it on the other bike while it's on the ground. And just in case you don't know how to pump up a tire, I will show you how. So I'm loosening up this piece here. I'm taking it all the way back and then forward just a little bit, turning it left, righty tighty, lefty loosey, pushing this thing onto the valve, and then open up this piece right here. And I'm going to take them to 80. So pushing up and down, and I didn't get any air right away, so I just adjusted it a little bit, and now the air is flowing nicely. So we pump it up, and it's not flowing right now. There we go. We push that piece back and pop the valve off and tighten it up, and she's ready to rumble. So I'm going to go do the same thing for this bike, making sure all the bolts are tight, clean up the chain rings and the chain, and make it ready to go. Have a great ride today, everybody. I hope you can get out on your bikes and enjoy this beautiful springtime weather. Thanks for joining me.